All right, so we're going to try and finish off our little series for Unit 1, and we're going to be going through the basics of economic systems. So this is going to be a 3-lesson series, lesson 4, 5, and 6. So let's just started off with the basics. Basically, the things we want to accomplish in this particular lesson is we're going to define what an economic system is. We're going to differentiate between traditional command and market economies. We're going to analyze the characteristics of a traditional economy and summarize the strengths and weaknesses. We're going to summarize how a centrally planned economy functions. We're going to differentiate between communism, socialism, and democratic socialism. We're going to identify the key components to the economic concept of Marxism, and analyze the characteristics of command economies, summarizing the strengths and weaknesses. That's a lot to do, but we don't have, it seems like a lot to do, but it's really not. This is going to go through pretty quickly. So let's just do a little bit of review. We know that scarcity is basically the idea that we all have limited resources. And we've also talked about how we have 3 types of questions that scarcity produces. And those are what's listed on the screen. What should be produced, how should it be produced, and for whom will it be produced. So basically what happens is economic systems are created by countries to try and figure out how we're going to actually answer all 3 of those questions. So how am I going to actually satisfy the unlimited wants and needs of my people in terms of what should be produced, how should it be produced, and for whom will it be produced for? In all 3 of the economic systems that we're going to talk about over the course of this series has different answers that they come up with to provide solutions for those questions. So the 3 types of economic systems are traditional, command, and market. So those are the 3 we focused on. The thing that I want you to really make sure that you understand is that none of these really work in the modern world as just simple traditional, simple command, and simple market. Like for instance, the United States, though it has a heavy deal of market influence, it's not completely market. We have examples of traditional within it. We have examples of command within it as well. If you look at communism, which is extremely command, there are still some aspects of market involved usually these days. When you try and go strictly command, it tends to fail. The Soviet Union tried to do that, and it's not around anymore. But we'll talk about strengths and weaknesses with all of these. So let's get started with traditional. Basically, traditional is based off of, it's like really, really old-fashioned. It's based off of customs and traditions. So one of the things that happens is it's like, well, this is how we did it before, and this is how we're going to keep doing it. And if we look back at the 3 questions that scarcity leads to, the answer is always going to be the same thing. And the answer is going to be whatever ensures survival. What are we going to Who are we going to make it for? Well, whatever ensures survival. And how are we going to make it? Well, of course, it's the same answer, whatever ensures survival. So there are advantages and disadvantages with every economic system that we're going to talk about. So let's get into the advantages and disadvantages of the traditional. Well, the advantage is everybody knows their role within the community because it's been done that way for years and years and years. And obviously an advantage is that survival is ensured because that's the main focus in a traditional economy. The problems, though, is that they're not very adaptable and they're very resistant to change. And we also have some things that aren't listed in here is that people tend to abandon it too because the other types of economic systems seem so much more attractive than what traditional has to offer. The other thing we could talk about as far as a disadvantage is it doesn't allow for specialization. So specialization basically means that I get to do what I do best. My role isn't defined by what I do best. It's defined by whatever tradition is. So if the tradition is that men are to go out and hunt and gather, or whatever it is, maybe it's to work in the factory. What if they're not very good at that? Then that means that we're not very productive. That means that we are wasting resources and certainly not being very efficient. What if a woman could hunt better than a man? If we're looking way back in time, that she doesn't have the opportunity to do that. What if a man does some jobs at home better than a woman? So specialization just doesn't occur, and that's one of the reasons why they're not very efficient. So those are advantages and disadvantages as far as traditional. Now, getting into command systems, you can find it in any one of these 3 different modes, socialism, communism, and democratic socialism, and most students have trouble at first trying to figure out what the difference is. So socialism is basically where the government starts to take control of aspects of the economy. In socialism, it's not a all or nothing thing. That would be communism. Communism is like socialism on steroids. So with socialism, you still have some sorts of freedom. It's certainly not anywhere near as what you would find in a pure market economy. But you'll have state ownership. So when we talk about mixed economies later, we'll get into more of how that actually works. So I already talked about communism, and I'll have a little bit more on that later. But democratic socialism throws people off a lot of times. You look at people; they even identify people who run for president or other political offices. They say, "Oh, I'm a democratic socialist," and people are like, "Oh, well, what does that mean? It must be good because it's democratic." And then some people are like, "Oh, it must be bad because it has socialist in it." Basically, what that is that you go ahead and pass things that resemble socialism through the democratic process. So you've had things like that passed in the United States. You have Social Security because that's a social welfare program. Another example of democratic socialism, and those ideas really started to take off in the early 1900s and through the mid 1900s in both Europe and in the United States. So you didn't have Social Security always. You had to have a crisis that basically occurred to get Social Security to start off. So let's get a little further into socialism. So there's one main figure that basically people identify with communism. Now, he wasn't the only person who came up with this because he did have a partner, but we don't need to really talk about him. So what is he observing? So Karl Marx grows up. He lives within the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, and he's basically living with a friend whose father is part of the bourgeoisie class. And you're probably, I don't even know what that means. So bourgeoisie class is basically you're wealthy, but you don't have a title of nobility. So his father, essentially owns some factories during the Industrial Revolution. And what he's noticing is that basically the lifestyle, the quality of life of the working class continues to be poor. But what happens is that the bourgeoisie, their quality of living is just skyrocketing and taking off. So he comes up with this idea basically that all of mankind, all of history within the world has been a battle between classes. And at first it was a battle between the people who were wealthy but didn't have nobility, so that would be the bourgeoisie class, and the nobility, and essentially the bourgeoisie would win out. And what happens is whoever is controlling the government will always make policies that was basically decisions that favor the ruling class. So when the nobility were ruling, they were constantly making decisions that favored the nobility. And when the bourgeoisie take over, they're the ones making decisions that benefit the bourgeoisie. And we don't need to get into the specifics as to how. That's, if you want to do that, that's advanced placement European history. And so what he thinks is that, well, you look at everybody, the majority of the world is the working class, and they've basically got the short end of the stick. And because it's always a battle between classes, what we really should make is a classless society. And what you would do is you would basically have some sort of violent revolution, and that's exactly what happens in Russia, which is where communism takes off, where basically the working class overthrows the ruling class. A classless society is set up, and the way that you do that is essentially the government controls everything. The other thing you need to make note of is that communism really hates the market economy. They think it's very evil. They think a lot of the problems that occur within the world are because of competition and some of the ideas within the market principles. But that's basically how communism functions. I mean, we're not going to get into it that deep. It's not something we have to entirely focus on for the purpose of this lesson. Let's get into some advantages and disadvantages of the command economy, though. So an advantage is that everyone's taken care of. So if you're sick, if you're elderly, I mean, I've got a grandma who's in her 80s. She can't work. What is she going to do? She's just going to be like, sorry, grandma, you're on your own. Obviously we have family that could take care of her, but what if she didn't have any family? What if she outlived all her children and grandchildren? Would she just be out of luck? Well, when we get to a market economy, the answer would be, well, yeah. In a command economy, she is taken care of, and the people who might be homeless, those people would be taken care of ideally as well. The other things too that are an advantage is that when we look at market economies later, the whole idea is choice. I get to basically choose what to make, and we know that companies are all about making money. Well, what if there's a product that is out there that people need, but it's not very profitable? Well, in a command economy, those things still get made, and some of those examples might be medicine. So we make sure that people are still being taken care of, but there are also some disadvantages too. If I know I'm going to be taken care of, how hard am I going to work? There's little incentive for me to do better, and it obviously leads to me wasting resources, which is underutilization. I'm not very efficient. In some cases, we have very little freedom. If you dive deeper into how communism functions, there isn't very much freedom. Actually, there's none. There's not even any private ownership as far as communism is concerned. Socialism, they allow for a little bit. Central planning, too. If the government, let's go back to the three questions that scarcity leads to. When we talk about, how are things going to be made? Government tells you how it's going to be made. What's going to be made? Same answer. Government tells you. And who's it going to be made for? Well, the government tells you who it's going to be made for. So let's get to that last point, though. Central planning is often unaware of local needs. So the central government is making all the decisions as far as the economy goes. Well, that's great. Not really, because what if I live, like for me, example, I live in a small city on the border of Wayne and Monroe County. There's no way, let's just assume that the United States was a command economy. Nobody in Washington, D.C. probably has any clue as to what the needs are of the people in the community that I live in. So a lot of times what we talk about for a disadvantage is that the needs of the local communities are not exactly taken into account. So you might be thinking, well, this doesn't sound very good, or you might be thinking it sounds great. Socialism, command economies still exist within the world. Venezuela has one. You might want to see how that's working out. There's some people who believe that socialism works out very well. So go ahead and see if you can go do the learning targets that were associated with this particular lesson. If you can, you're going to be in great shape moving forward.